This time our topics are cognitive and behavioral theories. Let's start with the behavioral theories. There are three different schools of thought here. The first is respondent or classical conditioning, identified mostly with Pavlov. And you may remember from undergraduate courses Pavlov's experiments in classical conditioning involving dogs. He paired two different stimuli, the presentation of food, a sort of natural stimulus that is met with a natural response, that is salivation. And that's paired with an artificial stimulus, the ringing of a bell. And over time, when those two stimuli are presented together, the dog learns to salivate in response to either one of them. So the dog will salivate in response to the ringing of a bell. Now this works really well for dogs. My dog salivates every time I ask her to sit, because many times when I've asked her to sit, I give her a reward. So now when I say sit, she licks her chops. Okay, B.F. Skinner said that's fine, but there are other ways in which we learn, and he developed a theory of operant conditioning that is focused, instead of on the stimuli, on the consequences of a behavior. So he said that our learning is shaped by what happens afterwards, consequences. And there are two forms of operant conditioning. One is reinforcement, and the other is punishment or extinction. Reinforcement is anything aimed at increasing the likelihood or the frequency of a behavior. So we use it to encourage behaviors, to teach new behaviors, to get behaviors that we want. There are two types of reinforcement. Positive reinforcement involves rewarding the behavior that we want, so providing a pleasurable stimulus. So for example, we could say to a child, if you get your homework done, you'll have an extra hour of television tonight. That's a reward. Negative reinforcement is also aimed at increasing the frequency of a behavior that we want, but it involves the removal of an aversive or unpleasant stimulus. So here we would say to a child, if you get your homework done on time, you don't have to do the dishes tonight, removing an unpleasant event. Punishment and extinction are aimed at reducing or getting rid of a behavior that we don't want. So punishment involves the provision of an aversive or unpleasant stimulus. So a child is punished by saying something like, if you don't do your homework, you're going to have to do dishes an extra night this week. Extra aversive stimuli. Extinction involves removing a reward, but it also involves removing all rewards, including attention. So basically you pay no attention to that behavior in the hopes that it will go away. That is actually difficult to do in practice. We know through many experiments by Skinner and others that reinforcement teaches new behaviors and encourages behaviors that we want. Punishment does not teach people new behaviors. We also know that intermittent positive reinforcement is the most effective way to teach and encourage behavior. Skinner and others experimented with different reinforcement schedules. So they would provide reinforcement every single time someone did the desired behavior, every other time, every third time, randomly, and so on. And they found that intermittent reinforcement, meaning random, occasional reinforcement, was more effective than reinforcement every single time. And the reason for this is twofold. One is that if you reinforce a behavior every single time, the behavior becomes dependent on the reward. And if the reward is not available, you're not going to get that behavior. So it's not going to generalize to situations in which the reward is not available. And second, when you reward behavior occasionally, randomly, the person or dog or the subject has to work harder, has to perform the behavior more often in order to get the reward. And it generalizes to situations in which the reward is not immediately obvious. Extinction often doesn't work because any slip-up, any attention to the behavior that you don't want can be viewed as intermittent reinforcement. So it has the opposite effect of the intended program. Bandura social learning theory combines and expands on these two types of conditioning. Bandura noticed that Pavlov was interested in antecedents, stimuli, and responses or behavior, and Skinner is interested in behavior and its consequences, and he puts all of these together in this ABC model, looking at antecedents, behavior, and consequences. So he's combining the two forms of conditioning, saying that both of these can be tools for learning, but he adds some important new ideas. One of these ideas is that learning is not limited to our immediate experience. It does not depend solely on the stimuli or consequences that we experience. We also learn from models by watching others through vicarious learning. Now, this is a powerful teacher. So you may remember from undergraduate courses, Bandura did a number of experiments on the influence of TV watching on children's behavior. He was particularly interested in the effect of violence on TV on children. And so in the TV room, he had these Bobo dolls, which are sort of these blow-up dolls. They were often painted to look like clowns, and they had weighted bottoms so that if a child hit the Bobo doll, it wobbled. And he would watch children watching TV, and sometimes the TV programs that they watched had violent models, and sometimes they didn't. And he noticed that when children watched violent models, they were more likely to hit the Bobo doll. So this was, their actions were not based at all on rewards and consequences that they experienced. They were based solely on vicarious learning. And this vicarious learning or imitation was even more powerful when the model, the person that they were watching, was similar to the child, was admired by the child, a hero, let's say, and was successful in the eyes of the observer, in the eyes of the child. So when the model is rewarded for the behavior, the child is more likely to copy it. Another important idea in Bandura's social learning theory is self-efficacy. Bandura thought that self-efficacy is an important mediator of behavior and change, and he has an entire book on self-efficacy. So self-efficacy encompasses a set of beliefs or cognitions or thoughts about the extent to which we will be effective or successful. It's our belief about how likely it is we will succeed. So this is not the same thing as self-esteem. Self-esteem means self-worth, our sense of worthiness. Self-efficacy is closer to the idea of internal locus of control. So in psychology, some years ago, some psychologists focused on internal versus external locus of control. And this means the extent to which you think that power is located within you or outside of you. So if you think that you have the power to do something, you have a strong internal locus of control. If you think that your world is largely controlled by others, by fate, by luck, by gods or a god, then you have a relatively external locus of control. So again, self-efficacy is closer to internal locus of control, but it's not exactly the same thing. It's the sense that I can be effective in accomplishing certain tasks. So Bandura said that he thought we have a global sense of self-efficacy, which is a general sense of how effective we can be, how likely we are to succeed in the world, how much power we have to accomplish the things we want to accomplish. And he also said that he thought we have a specific sense of self-efficacy in regard to certain tasks. So for example, if I want to modify my diet and quit smoking cigarettes, I may have a sense of my self-efficacy in relation to each of these tasks. And that's not the same thing. I may think it's easier to modify my diet than it is to quit smoking. or the other way around. But Bandura said we develop ideas about how efficacious we are likely to be in response to specific tasks. And then our global sense of self-efficacy is important because it drives how hard we will try to do things. If we don't think we're likely to succeed, we're less likely to try. That's why self-efficacy is such an important mediator of behavior and change for Bandura. So where does self-efficacy come from? Bandura identified 4 possible sources of self-efficacy, and these are important because these are ways in which we can build a sense of self-efficacy in ourselves and in others. So one of these sources is mastery, or past experience. So if we've succeeded in attempts in the past, we're likely to think we can succeed in the future, and our sense of self-efficacy will be greater than if we think of our past as a series of failures. So one of the ways to build self-efficacy in clients and in ourselves is to set up a series of steps that are easily mastered. Break a task down into doable steps and ensure mastery at each step in the way. So we're going from success to success. That's why in the addictions field they often say 1 day at a time, looking at small, doable increments and building success on success. A second source of self-efficacy is vicarious learning or modeling. So when we watch others succeed, our sense of our ability to succeed increases. And again, the similarity of the model matters. So when we see people who we think are like us, trying to achieve goals that we have and succeeding, we're more likely to think that we can do it too. And again, in addictions treatment, this is why many professionals are themselves recovering addicts and alcoholics. It's helpful to people who are in recovery to see others who've succeeded. A third source of self-efficacy is verbal persuasion. Simply telling somebody that they can do it. You can do it if you try. Encouragement is effective in building self-efficacy. And a fourth source of self-efficacy has to do with our physiological or affective states. So when we are fearful or full of anxiety, this interferes with our performance and it interferes with self-efficacy. How we feel in our body and our emotions affects self-efficacy. When we feel calm, strong, untroubled, unhurried, our sense of efficacy is greater than when we're fearful, distracted, disturbed, or unsure. So again, our physical comfort, our emotional states affect self-efficacy. Let's turn now and look at cognitive theories. Again, 3 categories here. The first is Piaget's stages of cognitive development. Piaget talked about schema, or the organizing systems that we have for making sense of the world. And he talked about assimilation and accommodation. Assimilation means taking new information and putting it into existing schema, while accommodation means taking new information, attempting to put it into existing schema, finding that the schema does not work, and adapting the schema to accommodate new information. Now, this is important in a lot of ways because Piaget said that assimilation, putting new information into existing categories, is a lot easier than accommodation. And sometimes we fail to accommodate when we should. So the schema might be, for example, in early child development, names for animals. So we have this idea that there are different types of animals, and our schema for animals includes some categories. And depending on whether we have pets at home, our categories might begin with words for dog and cat. Now, if our schema just includes dog, we may put all animals into the dog category. So when we see a cat, we call it dog. That's a failure to accommodate. Instead, we'll be told, no, that's a cat, and now we must accommodate our schema, and we have the categories dog and cat. What do we do when we encounter other animals? We either assimilate them into the existing schema or hopefully accommodate, expand the schema to include other categories. So this is a very important structure for cognitive development. Another source of information in cognitive theory has to do with information processing. And this comes from work on computer science, communication, and neuroscience. Instead of structures, the way Piaget was thinking about it, this looks at how information is processed, how it flows. And a third source of information on cognitive theory comes from treatment approaches, such as the treatment approaches by Ellis and Beck. We'll come back to this in a bit. So cognitive phenomena include these processes, again, of how we think. That involves memory, how we search our memory, trying to remember things, retrieve information from memory, and how we store memories. It also includes what are called executive functions, problem solving, reasoning, solving math problems, etc. And cognitive structures, what we think, and here again we think about Piaget's schemas, categories organizing the structure of our thinking. This includes concepts or ideas like dog, cat, and propositions or relationships between concepts. Dogs are like cats in certain ways and different in other ways. So those are propositions. And then another phenomenon is called metacognition, which means knowing what we know. This is something that children become aware of fairly early on. They become able to reflect on what it is they know. Piaget's stages of cognitive development are shown in this slide. There are 4 stages, fairly rough. The first is the sensory motor stage, which Piaget thought lasted the first 2 years of life, in which he thought that we learn about the world through images and movement. So we watch things, we watch objects, we watch their properties, we notice that things fall when they're dropped due to, later on we learn that it's because of gravity, we learn that balls roll when we push them, and he thought that we're storing information in terms of images. The next stage is called the pre-operational stage, lasting from 2 to 7 years of life, in which information is largely stored in words. So the pre-operational stage focuses on language, the development of vocabulary, labels for objects. And then we have the concrete operation stage, thought to be around 7 to 11 years, in which it's called concrete operations because we're actually manipulating matter and numbers. So math, 2 plus 2 equals 4, is a manipulation, an operation that we perform on numbers. And matter, putting 2 balls of clay together, rolling them out, looking at the properties of physical objects, elementary physics are all part of concrete operations. So at this stage, we learn about basic physics and properties like conservation. If I take a ball of clay and I roll it out into a snake, it's still the same thing, even though it looks different. We learn about reversibility. I can take my clay snake and squish it back into the ball, and it's still the same thing. We learn about seriation. That means the order of things, that numbers are ordered, letters in the alphabet are ordered. We learn about classification. Animals come in mammal, bird, reptile, fish, etc. We learn about combination, again, math and science ideas. And then the last stage in Piaget's schema is formal operations. And this is developed, he thought, sometime between 11 and 15 years of age or maybe later. And here we're talking about science as a main way of learning about the world. So at this stage, people become capable of scientific reasoning, which means hypothesis generation and testing. Now, Piaget thought that not everybody gets to this formal operation stage, and he and others noticed that many people don't use scientific reasoning, particularly in cultures that don't value science. So it's interesting that science is viewed as the highest form of reasoning here. There's no coincidence that this is a theory developed in a Western context that values scientific reasoning. So just a quick review of Piagetian concepts. Schemas are the categories we use to structure our thinking. Schemas are develop in two ways. Assimilation means putting new information into existing categories, whether it fits or not. And accommodation means changing or refining the schema to account for new, discrepant information. And the principle here is that assimilation is easier than accommodation, and this can lead to what we call confirmation bias, which is the tendency to make new information conform to what we think we already know, ignoring evidence to the contrary. This is a big form of mistakes in cognition, something we've known about for hundreds of years, confirmation bias. Let's turn now to talk about cognitive and behavioral therapies. So here the idea is that cognition affects emotion, which in turn drives behavior. So we can't directly change affect. We can't directly change how we or others feel, but we can change how we think and how we act. So there are a variety of therapies that do this. Cognitive behavioral therapies tend to be short-term, structured, and problem-focused, focused on particular goals. There are many variations here. So for example, Ellis is responsible for what's called rational emotive therapy, or RET. Ellis thought that irrational thoughts are the source of a lot of mental health problems. So for him, therapy involved examining the client's thoughts and using reality testing to check and hopefully change irrational thinking. And if irrational thinking can be explored and changed, he thought that some mental health problems could be resolved. Beck developed cognitive and behavioral therapy for anxiety and depression, and he thought that depression in particular is caused by negative thoughts, often negative thoughts about oneself. So here the idea is that people who have low self-esteem are constantly doing negative self-talk, saying to themselves internally, thinking, I'm no good, I can't do it, I'm not a valuable person. That's what causes depression in his view. And the idea is to identify and change those negative thinking, those negative thoughts. We also have trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapies, which focus on traumatic events, but ensure first that the client is in a safe place so that the emotional arousal, fearful response to painful memories, difficult thoughts and emotions can be managed. So we're managing thoughts and behavior in a controlled setting. In these cognitive and behavioral therapies, what we're doing is identifying irrational or negative self-talk, the things we tell ourselves often automatically, and trying to replace this with more rational, positive thinking. So early on, people talked about developing mantras, things that you would say to yourself. So the idea was you'd wake up in the morning and say 10 times or something, I'm a good person, I'm going to have a great day. So it's associated with I think it's Stuart Smiley character on old Saturday Night Live shows, I'm a good person and people like me. That kind of positive self-talk. Now, it sounds silly the way I'm describing it now, but there is something to this idea of identifying the messages that we're giving ourselves automatically, partially unconsciously, and replacing them with more constructive, adaptive ideas. Then there's also an attempt at structured behavioral change using reinforcement schedules, especially intermittent positive reinforcement. And you see this in trauma-focused CBT and other forms of CBT. Another model that's based on cognitive and behavioral theories is this trans-theoretical model, or stages of change. This is developed by Jim Prochaska and Carlo Di Clemente. And the stages of change are thought to characterize all change efforts, whether in therapy or not, whether intentional or not, and in relation to any problem behavior or cognition. So the stages, as some of you have heard of this in practice, I'm sure, are contemplation, meaning I'm not even thinking I have a problem, I have no intention to change. This is akin to denial. Contemplation, thinking maybe I have a problem, maybe there's something I ought to do. To preparation, getting ready for the change. Action, making change happen. And maintenance, maintenance of the changed state. So this is used sometimes in addictions treatment, and when maintenance is thought of as relapse prevention. Most of the research on this has to do with the cessation of cigarette smoking, but it's also been studied in addictions and in a variety of public health areas and in mental health to some extent. But my own work with colleagues, especially with my colleague Heather Gervin, shows that these stages don't hold up in research, that people actually can be in multiple stages at once. I can be in action and pre-contemplation at the same time. And if that's the case, then there really isn't a stage theory. If you can be in different stages at once, the stages aren't discrete, and that undermines the stage theory. What are some of the strengths of cognitive and behavioral theories? They're useful for short-term goal-oriented treatment. If a client has a specific problem that she wants to address, and insurance will cover it for a short period of time, CBT may be an appropriate treatment. CBT is highly structured, which some clients like. There are a lot of self-assessment tools, homework tools, some charting, some journaling, some graphing. And that structure is comforting and clear to some people. CBT is testable. It produces hypotheses that are verifiable. And there's some considerable evidence, empirical evidence, for some change strategies, not all of them. But exposure therapy, for example, is demonstrably successful. So we know that when people are exposed to a stimulus that they're afraid of, like a snake or a traumatic memory, if they're exposed to that object or memory gradually and in a safe way in which their physical and emotional states are well managed, their fear or discomfort with the stimuli will decrease. That's exposure therapy. So there's good evidence for that. There's good evidence for reinforcement, as I said before, particularly positive intermittent reinforcement is effective in changing behavior. Another advantage is that CBT provides clear targets for change. So it's clear what problems we're working on. It's clear that we're often trying to build self-efficacy so that we'll be more successful in changing behavior. Some of the targets are changing irrational and negative thinking, so it's really clear what it is we're trying to change. There's also an emphasis on the present, here and now, on realistic, achievable objectives, on strengths, building efficacy again, success and mastery, and on hope that the situation can be improved. What are some of the limitations? Well, there's often a limited focus or scope of cognitive behavioral therapy focused on solving a particular problem. You could argue that there may be a lack of depth there, lack of long-term engagement with the person, lack of engagement on deeper issues. There may be limited attention to affect or emotional aspects of the experience. There's limited attention to the distant past We're not looking at all past experiences or all life events. We're being selective. And the structure of CBT does not appeal to everyone. So the task orientation, the homework, journaling, graphing, charting does not appeal to everyone. Some people like to talk. Stage theories, particularly the stages of change, don't hold up empirically. Piaget's stages don't hold up empirically. And I would argue that another limitation of this approach is that it pays attention to individual problems versus macro conditions. So, for example, in the treatment of depression or anxiety, the focus is on individual self-talk. And that might be a useful coping strategy, but the cause of one's anxiety or depression could be external. CBT really has nothing to say about that. It focuses on intrapersonal solutions only. Okay, so how do we use CBT and the cognitive behavioral therapies in social work? Behavioral management is still used quite often with children and others, particularly this idea of giving intermittent positive reinforcement. Clearly that's effective in teaching children and encouraging behavior that we want. We also use this idea of successive approximation. So if we're trying to teach a child a complex task, the idea is that you reward steps toward the task. So every time the child gets closer to doing it, we reward this approximation. And the closer you get, the greater the reward. Another version of this is systematic desensitization, which is used in treating phobias. Again, if somebody is afraid of snakes, you might start with a picture of the snake on the other side of the room, and we work at making sure that the client is comfortable, calm, and okay with this. And then gradually we get closer to the picture, maintaining this calm state. So we're systematically becoming desensitized to the image of the snake. Later on, it's actually a real snake. And as long as we maintain the sense of calm and control, the phobia gradually can diminish. The emphasis on positive thoughts and behaviors is another strength of this theory and common use in social work. Focus on building self-efficacy is another very useful idea here, that when clients have struggled with mastery in the past, it's important to help them succeed and to lay out a series of tasks that will guarantee success at every point in the way, so you can build on that. It's also very important to convey hope that the situation can be improved. So we often talk about setting people up for success, and we do that with mastery, encouragement, and modeling, or vicarious learning, and also by helping people manage anxiety and fear. So CBT, as you know, is used in treating trauma. It's commonly used in treatment for mood and anxiety disorders. Here's a poem for you to enjoy, I hope, Beyond the Stages of Change. This has to do with awareness. And that's all for now.